Welcome back to Hand Drink Solo, where we review curious wines for curious minds. And today's wine of the day is the RAAR Carbonic Maceration Syrah, made by winemaker Sheree Nothnagel. And she's using fruit that is from the Swartland in the Kasteelberg area, just inside specified Swartland wine ward. Carbonic maceration is a winemaking technique that kind of manages to produce alcohol through magic inside a grape. So it can do so even though there's no yeast present, through a completely different little set of chemical reactions. Now, the result of this process is that tannins are softer and fruit becomes candied and hugely aromatic and almost floral. And what happened is that this process came to the fore in Beaujolais, which is a little sub-region of Burgundy in France, and it created these wild wines that kind of managed to gloss over the sometimes rustic edges of some of Beaujolais wines, and there was this fiesta of wine joy over what they called Beaujolais Nouveau. There's videos on that elsewhere that I've made. In South Africa, winemakers took this process and they flipped the script and applied it to pinotage. So you had this process softening some of the rough tannins that pinotage had, and you had it glossing and polishing some of the bolshy fruit that pinotage had, and then it brought with it its usual kind of sherbet and candy elements, which makes every day feel like a party. And this really was a fascinating vibe shift for pinotage as a cultivar, and I must be honest, one that was not completely unwelcome. And so, having seen Gamay in Beaujolais be turned into the equivalent of, I guess, Ribena juice once it's earned its master's degree, and then having pinotage from being bolshy and overly fruited being a light-footed aromatic party in a glass, you'd think that would be enough for winemakers to call it a day. But no, because what we have before us today is neither Gamay nor pinotage, it's Syrah, Carbonic Maceration Syrah. But carbonic maceration as a technique is not as foreign to Shiraz or Syrah as you might think, because if you've been paying attention to winemaking trends in South Africa, you may have noticed labels more and more frequently say things like whole bunch Syrah or whole bunch fermented, and really that is a trend that's not new at all, but has definitely been forefronted in the last few decades. And what that is where you take grapes on the bunches still as a whole bunch and throw it in and ferment everything together. And what you get is spice from the stems. You also get some of that intracellular fermentation that happens in carbonic maceration. So it's a kind of semi-carbonic maceration. It's carbonic maceration, but without all the space-age tanks and pipes and CO2. But this particular wine is full-on carbonic maceration wine with all the space-age tanks and pipes and loads of CO2. And that makes it not only delightfully uncommon, but also fascinating to drink. As mentioned earlier, the brains behind this little project is winemaker Sheree Nothnagel. Now, Sheree is responsible for making an eye-watering number of wines every single vintage in a huge array of different styles as well, which not only takes a huge amount of talent, but also an incredible memory just to remember what's what. But if Sheree is a winemaker that makes us excited, the RAAR range is a series of wines that makes her excited, because it's just this massive left field experimental cultivar mix of wines like Palomino, Petit Syrah, Skin Contact Chenin Blanc, Grenache Blanc, and of course this Carbonic Maceration Syrah. So as I say, you have these wild, crazy, offbeat cultivars, but made within a co-op setting. So it's like this small batch wine rebellion from inside a bulk wine fortress. So when we give this guy a sniff, well, we have almost everything you could possibly hope for from a Shiraz wine, in that we definitely have some of those stemmy herbal notes that present as oregano or maybe fresh thyme. There's a little touch of savory leather perhaps, but then there's the fruit, red plum and candied cherries, riper elements of blackberry, and even a hint of kind of slightly savory red licorice. But what happens when we give it a sip? Well, again, fairly dynamic, because you do have elements of fresh blackberry fruit, but then you've got the brighter, sweeter hints of candied fruit, candied cherry, a little bit of sherbet, and then you have the classic clove spice, pepper spice. There's even a little bit of cardamom in there. And the tannins that keep it all in check are, as to be expected, delightfully silky. So we mentioned that this wine was fairly rare in that it's one of South Africa's very few full-on carbonic maceration Syrahs. But it's also rare within the class of carbonic maceration wines because many winemakers are afraid of the carbonic maceration process a little bit because it can overwhelm the quality of your grape by producing all the sherbet and party music and candied fruit. And so they often steer towards semi-carbonic or try and mix things up and blend various components. But this is a complete carbonic maceration wine that manages to show some of the candied, fruity, sherbety, party elements that come from carbonic maceration. But it also shows those notes of cardamom and clove and pepper and fresh blackberry, which is very much from the cultivar of Shiraz. So it manages to use the full carb mac process without losing the identity of Shiraz at the core of the wine. So instead of having a carbonic maceration wine that feels like the Mardi Gras, it very much feels like Syrah, but just with a heck of a bounce in its step. Well done, Sheree Nothnagel. If you want to dig deeper into the kind of work that Sheree does, I've left links to 2 videos. One is her Skin Contact Chenin Blanc under the RAAR range, and the other is her RAAR Grenache Blanc, as I said earlier, both made with Swartland fruit.